She teaches herself to operate an industrial sawmill that weighs as much as a loaded pickup truck, puts every mistake on camera, and ends up building a YouTube channel that crosses 80 million views while still showing up to dance class every week. That's Emerald Breon, the woman at the center of lumber capital Log Yard. And if you think you already know this story from watching the channel, you don't. Because the part that actually explains how she got here is the part that almost never happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what it took for a young woman with zero background in the timber industry to become the face, the voice, and the driving force behind one of the most watched sawmill channels in the country. Before there was a channel, before there was a sawmill, there was a man in rural Pennsylvania with a chainsaw and a truck. Ken Breon is what you'd call a self-made first-generation logger. He didn't inherit a business. He didn't learn the trade through apprenticeship or schooling. He started from nothing. A residential tree removal company called Ironwood Acres launched in 2005 out of Cogan Station, a small community in Lycoming County, north-central Pennsylvania. The early years were hard in ways that don't come across easily in a 5-minute YouTube video. The economy turned. Natural disasters hit. There were periods where the business morphed entirely just to survive. At one point, Ken was climbing problem trees at private properties and removing them limb by limb from the top down. At another point, he was selling Pennsylvania native saplings. At another, he was making mulch. Whatever the land gave him, he sold it. Whatever the customer needed, he figured out how to provide it. Firewood became the consistent revenue stream. And firewood at scale means you need space. So Ken bought property. Property meant opportunity. And opportunity meant the first lumber mill, a Wood-Mizer LT-15, a compact portable sawmill that he ran himself, often working over 80 hours a week, logging through the day, milling in the evening, no hired help, just a man and the machine he'd taught himself to operate. This was the business that Emerald Breon grew up alongside. Not in theory, in practice. She and her siblings were brought to the log yard after school. The chores were simple at first, stacking campfire wood, cleaning up sawdust, keeping their father company while he worked. But the log yard was an education, not the kind that comes with a diploma, the kind where you learn by watching, and then by doing, and eventually by being trusted with more than anyone expected. And if you think that background was enough to predict what Emerald would eventually build, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Most people who follow lumber capital log yard today think of Emerald and Jade as the faces of the business, but they weren't always first in line. Ken and Terry have a larger family than the YouTube channel typically reveals. Before Emerald and Jade had any real role in the operation, the two oldest Breon children, Samantha and Zachariah, were the ones handed the first opportunity. The family website addresses this directly. They were the first in line to become owner-operators. They came in, worked the business, and were given the chance to build something with it. They chose not to stay. Samantha and Zachariah returned to their lives up north. They have families of their own now. The visits are infrequent, the connection remains, but the professional path diverged. And so the opportunity shifted, not by default, but by a deliberate family decision to restructure what came next. That decision had consequences, because when Emerald and Jade were old enough to take part in the business, Ken and Terry made a choice that's unusual even by the standards of family-run rural businesses. They didn't just hand the girls jobs, they set them up as legal owners. Lumber Capital Log Yard LLC was formally structured as a separate business entity from Ken's logging operation. Terry, Emerald, and Jade became the partners of record for the mill. Ken runs Ironwood Acres Timber Harvest, the logging side, as a solo operation. But the yard, the sales, the milling, the retail, the YouTube channel, the website, the orders, that belongs to the women. No employees, no outside help, just 3 women and a growing machine. Most people who know this story stop here. But the real story starts right now. Most people who follow Lumber Capital Log Yard today think of Emerald and Jade as the faces of the business, but they weren't always first in line. Ken and Terry have a larger family than the YouTube channel typically reveals. Before Emerald and Jade had any real role in the operation, the two oldest Breon children, Samantha and Zachariah, were the ones handed the first opportunity. The family website addresses this directly. They were the first in line to become owner-operators. They came in, worked the business, and were given the chance to build something with it. They chose not to stay. Samantha and Zachariah returned to their lives up north. They have families of their own now. The visits are infrequent, the connection remains, but the professional path diverged. And so the opportunity shifted, not by default, but by a deliberate family decision to restructure what came next. That decision had consequences. Because when Emerald and Jade were old enough to take part in the business, Ken and Terry made a choice that's unusual even by the standards of family-run rural businesses. They didn't just hand the girls jobs. They set them up as legal owners. Lumber Capital Log Yard, LLC, was formally structured as a separate business entity from Ken's logging operation. Terry, Emerald, and Jade became the partners of record for the mill. Ken runs Ironwood Acres Timber Harvest, the logging side, as a solo operation. But the yard, the sales, the milling, the retail, the YouTube channel, the website, the orders, that belongs to the women. No employees, no outside help, just 3 women and a growing machine. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. The LT70 is not a beginner's piece of equipment. Wood-Mizer's LT70 is an industrial-grade hydraulic sawmill. It can handle logs up to 35 inches in diameter. It cuts with precision measured in fractions of an inch. It is heavy, complex, and expensive to run. Professionals who operate this class of equipment typically have years of background with smaller mills before stepping up to something this size. When the family decided to upgrade from their earlier equipment to the LT70, the question was obvious: who was going to run it? The answer was Emerald, and she learned by doing. The family website describes her as having taken on the task of learning the LT70 when we upgraded. Understated language for what was actually a steep, hands-on education in operating industrial-grade machinery from scratch. She figured it out. She documented the process, and crucially, she did it on camera, in front of a growing audience that had no reason to expect anything less than competence from her. That combination, authentic skill acquisition, documented in real time, is what separates this channel from most sawmill content on YouTube. There's no pretense that everything works perfectly. There's no moment where Emerald stands in front of a finished product and explains what happened as if she'd mastered it years ago. The learning curve was the content. The mistakes were part of the story. At the same time Emerald was writing. The team page describes her as having written the captivating dialogue for the channel herself, scripting the educational content, the voiceovers, the species guides. She wasn't just the on-camera talent. She was the writer, the operator, the producer, and the face, often simultaneously. Here's what the comments kept asking about her, and here's the answer they never got, until now. Here's the part of Emerald Breon's story that doesn't fit the image people expect. She is a lifelong dancer. Not a former dancer, not a dancer who gave it up when she picked up a chainsaw. She still trains with her instructor every single week, has done for years. Her sister Jade does too. Both of them, multiple times a week, are somewhere in studio doing exactly what they've always done, long before either of them ever touched a sawmill. That detail matters more than it might seem. The stereotype of the rural blue-collar creator is a specific one, especially for women. Audiences often want a clean, uncomplicated narrative. The girl who left behind a softer world and chose the hard one. The dancer who became a logger. The story of reinvention and sacrifice. Emerald's actual story resists that frame entirely. There was no sacrifice. There was no pivot away from one identity toward another. She held both. She learned to operate industrial milling equipment, and she kept dancing. She wrote educational content for national woodworking publications, and she kept dancing. She built a channel to over 80 million views, and she kept dancing. That duality isn't incidental, it's character. The kind of person who maintains a disciplined physical practice alongside the physical demands of a working sawmill is someone who understands that commitment and identity are not zero-sum. You don't have to give up who you were to become who you're becoming. It also explains something about the content itself. Emerald's on-camera presence is precise. Her explanations of milling processes are structured and clear. Her educational segments on species characteristics, cherry, hickory, hemlock, eastern white pine, walnut, read like someone who has spent time understanding how to communicate a skill, not just perform it. That's not an accident. That's the product of someone who has spent years learning how to teach movement to a watching audience. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. In the sawmill industry, waste is a given. Milling lumber produces sawdust, bark, offcuts, and organic material that most small operations treat as a cost, something to dump, burn, or haul away. Managing it is a line item in the budget. It's overhead. Lumber Capital Log Yard approached it differently. The family operates on what they describe as a zero-waste strategy. The X account for the business summarizes it plainly. Premium lumber, firewood, and more. Zero waste strategy. That's the company identity in 8 words. And it's not just marketing language. The practice is real. Sawmill byproducts at Lumber Capital Log Yard are converted into charcoal and compost for sale. The sawdust, the bark, the organic offcuts, none of it leaves the yard as landfill. Ken runs the same philosophy on the logging side. He's spoken about the ongoing challenge of finding uses for every part of the tree. Firewood from one section, milled lumber from another, mulch from another. The charcoal and compost at the yard are the downstream result of that same thinking applied to the milling operation. For the YouTube channel, this becomes an underexplored layer of the content. Viewers who come for the sawmill videos are also watching a family demonstrate sustainable small business practice in an industry that rarely gets credit for it. The educational content Emerald produces for Woodworkers Journal on species characteristics, milling techniques, optimal handling for black cherry, hickory grain patterns, the unique properties of Pennsylvania hardwoods, is an extension of the same philosophy. Nothing wasted, everything taught. There's also the grandfather in the picture. In June of 2019, Terry's father Larry moved onto the property. He's known on the channel as Grandpa. He's the live-in mechanic. He renovated the garage, built a greenhouse and a chicken coop at the family home, and put an addition on the house. His mechanical knowledge is what keeps the equipment running without outside repair bills. His presence removed a cost center that would otherwise eat into a tight margin. That's the practical reality behind the content. An operation optimized at every point to eliminate dependency on outside labor or outside cost. The number that came next, nobody who followed this channel expected it. The channel launched on August 4th, 2020. That date is specific, and it matters. The world in August 2020 was not a normal content environment. Many creators who launched during that period benefited from an unusual traffic surge. People indoors, looking for something authentic, something grounded in physical reality and craft. Sawmill content, farming content, rural working life content, all of it saw an audience spike that carried certain channels from small to significant. Lumber Capital Log Yard was positioned perfectly for that moment, and it grew. By the numbers, over 224,000 subscribers, over 80.9 million total views, nearly 400 videos published in roughly the first 4 years of operation. Average video length around 10 minutes, long enough to be informative, short enough to hold attention. The content mix, educational species guides, daily milling operations, equipment demonstrations, firewood and delivery vlogs, and the running story of the family business itself. The channel's audience didn't find it because of a viral moment or a single breakout video. It built through consistency. Emerald published content at a rate that most solo creators would find unsustainable, while simultaneously running the actual physical business the content documented. The sawmill had to work, so there was something to film. The filming had to happen, so there was something to publish. And the publishing had to continue, so the audience had a reason to come back. That flywheel, physical work enabling content, content enabling audience, audience enabling business, is what turned a family sawmill in rural Pennsylvania into a nationally recognized brand in the timber space. Woodworkers Journal brought them in as educational contributors. Wood-Mizer, the company that made the very equipment Emerald taught herself to operate, featured the family on their podcast in March 2026. She went from teaching herself to use their machine on camera to being spotlighted by the manufacturer. That's not a small arc. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What she did instead is the part nobody talks about. Cogan Station, Pennsylvania sits in Lycoming County, a region with deep roots in the American timber industry. The forests of north-central Pennsylvania were some of the most heavily logged in the country during the late 1800s. The hemlock and white pine that came out of those woods built cities. The logging camps, the splash dams, the sawmills of that era shaped the landscape and the economy of the region for generations. That history is all around the property at 8328 Lycoming Creek Road, and the family knows it. The official history page for Lumber Capital Log Yard closes with something that most viewers scroll past: the girl's intention to eventually bring the area's timbering past to life by preserving a portion of the location's history, including showcasing historical logging artifacts on site. That's not a casual remark. In a family that states its goals plainly and backs them with action, that sentence represents a long-term commitment to turning the log yard into something more than a business. It's a cultural preservation project built into the future roadmap of a YouTube channel that most people only know for milling hickory boards. It means Emerald Breon and her family aren't just documenting what they do today. They're building towards something permanent, a physical site where the tools and artifacts of Pennsylvania's logging past are preserved and displayed, on the same land where the family is actively continuing that tradition with modern equipment. Not many creators in this space are thinking that far ahead, and fewer still have the credibility to pull it off. Because credibility in this world comes from the work, and Emerald has put the work on camera for 5 consecutive years. The story of Emerald Breon isn't about a woman who surprised people by doing a man's job. It's about a family that built something real, a sustainable, employee-free, zero-waste lumber business with an 80 million view media operation on top of it, and trusted their youngest operators to carry it forward. Emerald didn't get handed an audience. She got handed a log yard, a sawmill she hadn't learned to run yet, and a camera. What she built from those 3 things is still growing, still active, and, if the family follows through on the historical preservation goal, still just getting started. The channel is publishing now. The family is still on the property in Cogan Station. The LT-70 is still running, and Emerald is still showing up to dance class every week. Here's the question worth thinking about. The 2 older siblings, Samantha and Zachariah, had the first shot at what Emerald and Jade built, and chose a different life. Do you think they made the right call? Or does watching what lumber capital Log Yard has become make you wonder what they walked away from?